My brother stole my girl and mocked me at our father's funeral. Then he realized my new wife owns his entire career. The rain was a cold, needles-on-skin kind of drizzle that matched the gray mood of the Oakwood Cemetery. But the man standing across from the mahogany casket was radiating a heat of pure, unadulterated arrogance. My brother, Julian, hadn't changed a bit in 6 years. He still wore his hair in that perfectly windswept style that screamed old money, even though our family's accounts had been bone dry for a decade. He stood there with his arm wrapped tightly around Clara, the woman who was supposed to be my wife. Seeing them together still felt like a dull ache in a phantom limb, but the sharp, stabbing pain had long since passed. Clara looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting toward me and then away, unable to hold my gaze as she clutched her designer handbag. We were there to bury our father, a man who had spent his final years watching his 2 sons tear each other apart over a woman. When the service ended and the crowd of distant relatives began to thin out, Julian waited until we were standing just a few feet from the fresh mound of earth. He leaned in, his voice a low, jagged whisper that was meant to cut deeper than the loss of our parent. Julian looked at me and said, "It's a shame Dad didn't get to see us like this, Marcus. But hey, some guys just finish first. I got the girl, the legacy, and the life you weren't man enough to hold on to. I guess you're still just the runner-up." I didn't flinch. I didn't even raise my voice. I looked at his perfectly tailored suit, which I knew for a fact was 3 seasons old, and then at Clara, who looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her whole. I adjusted my cuffs and looked my brother dead in the eye. I said, "You still working that mid-level analyst job at Vandelay Industries, Julian? Still grinding away in that cubicle in the city?" Julian's face stiffened, his smug grin wavering for a fraction of a second before he puffed out his chest. He tightened his grip on Clara's waist and said, "It's a career path, Marcus. Something you wouldn't understand. I'm on track for senior VP by next year. I'm building a future for us while you're probably still doing freelance at work in some basement." I just smirked, a slow, deliberate expression that seemed to rattle him more than a punch would have. Just then, a long black Maybach pulled up to the curb of the cemetery path, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. The driver, dressed in a sharp black suit, stepped out and opened the rear door. A woman stepped out, and the air in the graveyard seemed to shift. She was wearing a coat that cost more than Julian's annual salary, and her presence was so commanding that even the wind seemed to die down. This was Vivian. As she walked toward us, her heels clicking rhythmically on the stone path, I saw Julian's eyes go wide. His hand actually slipped from Clara's waist, dropping to his side as if he'd been burned. Vivian reached my side and slid her arm through mine, leaning her head against my shoulder for a brief, supportive second before looking at the 2 people standing in front of us. She didn't need to be introduced. Anyone who read the financial papers knew who she was. Vivian Sterling, the woman who had spent the last 5 years turning Sterling Global into a titan that swallowed smaller firms for breakfast. Julian looked like he was about to faint. His mouth hung open, and his voice came out as a weak, pathetic squeak. Julian said, "MS. Sterling? What are you? Why are you here?" I felt Vivian's grip on my arm tighten slightly as she gave them a polite, ice-cold smile. She looked at me and then back at my brother. Vivian said, "I'm here to support my husband, Julian. Marcus has had a very difficult week, as I'm sure you know. Although I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you'd be back at the office. We've been reviewing the performance reports for the Vandelay acquisition all morning." The color drained from Julian's face so fast he looked like a ghost. Vandelay Industries had been bought out by Sterling Global 3 months ago, but the staff hadn't been told who the new silent partner was yet, until now. Julian looked at me, then at the Maybach, then at Clara, who was now staring at me with a mixture of horror and sudden, desperate regret. Julian stammered, "Husband? Marcus, you're married to Vivian Sterling?" I didn't give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I didn't tell him how ID met her in London, or how we'd built a life based on mutual respect and ambition rather than betrayal and ego. I just looked at the man who had stolen my past and realized he had absolutely no place in my future. I looked at Julian and said, The transition team will be in on Monday to discuss the layoffs, Julian. Make sure your desk is clean. Like you said, some guys just finish first. The walk back to the car felt like the final page of a very long, very painful book being turned. I didn't look back to see Clara crying or Julian standing paralyzed by the grave of the father he had disappointed. I just sat in the back of the car next to the woman who actually loved me, watching the cemetery fade into the distance through the tinted glass. 6 years ago, I thought my life was over because I lost a girl and a brother. I was wrong. My life only started the moment I stopped trying to win their race and started building my own empire. The next morning, my phone was blowing up. I had 17 missed calls from Julian and a dozen long, rambling texts from Clara. She was telling me how she had always thought about me and how things with Julian weren't what they seemed. She even had the nerve to say that she felt a spark when our eyes met at the funeral. I deleted every single one of them without replying. I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't the guy who waited for scraps of affection from people who treated loyalty like a suggestion. Vivian was sitting at the breakfast table, a tablet in one hand and a coffee in the other. She didn't even look up when she spoke. Vivian said, "Your brother's name is at the top of the redundancy list for the Vandelay branch, Marcus. Do you want me to keep him on? As a favor?" I sat down across from her, feeling the sun streaming through the windows of our penthouse. I thought about the way Julian had sneered at me over our father's body. I thought about the 6 years of silence and the way they had paraded their victory in front of everyone we knew. I took a sip of my coffee and looked at my wife. I said, "No favors, Vivian. Let the numbers speak for themselves. If he's not good enough for the company, he's not good enough for the company." She nodded once, a sharp, businesslike gesture, and that was it. The door was closed, locked, barred. Later that week, I heard through the grapevine that Clara had left Julian the moment his termination notice arrived. Apparently, true love didn't survive a loss of status and a mounting pile of credit card debt. They deserved each other, but in the end, they didn't even have that. I went back to the cemetery one last time a month later, when the grass had started to grow over the grave. It was a quiet afternoon, no rain, no drama. I stood there and just breathed. I realized then that Julian was right about one thing. Someone did finish first. But it wasn't the person who cheated to get to the line. It was the person who was still standing when the dust finally settled. I left a single flower on the stone and walked away, not as a runner-up, but as the man I was always meant to be.